Welcome to our webcast, How Panera Bread Automated Manual Billing Processes, brought to you by Argyle, the publisher of CFO Magazine and CFO.com, and sponsored by BillingPlatform. I'm Joe Fleischer, and I'll be your moderator. What I'd like to do is tell you about our very distinguished guest. Joining us today is John Davis, who is Senior Manager of Finance and Strategic Planning with Panera Bread. And by way of background, John joined Panera Bread in 2016 as a Senior Manager of Finance and added strategic planning to his responsibilities this year. He is responsible for cultivating and managing relationships with outside partners that provide solutions in line with Panera standards. Before he joined Panera, he spent 12 years in various financial planning and analysis and operational positions with increasing responsibility. Now, I would note that before we hear from John, I'd like to pose the first of our three polling questions to attendees. So our very first polling question asks attendees to indicate how you would characterize a level of billing automation at your company. And what you're welcome to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, and then click on the submit button so we can record your response. From top to bottom, the choices are: we have many manual billing processes and or use spreadsheets. We have a mix of automation and manual processes. Everything is automated. And if you don't know, you can select the radio button next to I don't know. And so what we can see, what is readily apparent, and this should not be a huge surprise, is that a majority of respondents indicate that they have a mix. This is not necessarily a surprise. Clearly, this is what we would expect, I think, is that a majority of respondents have a mix of automation and manual processes. I would note, though, that if you combine those who either have a mix or rely on manual billing processes and or spreadsheets, that's a pretty clear majority, and in fact, slightly under 3/4 of respondents. And then I would acknowledge also that a minority, slightly more than 13%, have automated their billing processes completely, and an equal percentage, interestingly enough, don't know. So I think that's a really good starting point. At this stage, what I'd like to do, and it is my pleasure to do so, turn the floor over to John Davis, once again, Senior Manager of Finance and Strategic Planning with Panera Bread. Please give a warm welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, as well as everybody else that is joining us today and this afternoon on this webcast. Welcome. So first of all, I'm going to go through today's agenda of what I'm going to be speaking of. First, we're going to talk about some of the billing challenges that we as Panera face and what we decided to do in order to conquer that solution. We're also going to discuss some billing best practices. Thirdly, we're going to talk about new products and subscription-based services billing. And then finally, I'm going to touch upon new billing solution implementation. So moving forward, I'm going to give some background on Panera Bread. So Panera Bread, we have over 2,000 bakery cafes across the United States and Canada. We have system-wide sales of over $5 billion. Just over 20% or $1.2 billion of our sales are in the digital space. We were the best performing restaurant stock over the last 20 years when we were a publicly held company. We have a loyalty program, which I'm sure some of you on this call are familiar with, which has over 28 million members, and we were acquired by JAB Holding Company within the last 2 years. So now I'm going to move forward and speak to you about an overview of our billing process and what it looked like. So some of the key components of it were, first of all, we bill our franchisees across anywhere from 50 to 100 products and services, which is ever-changing and fluctuates. And if you think about that prior slide we had just looked at, since a fifth of our sales are in the digital landscape, that digital landscape usually and will drive more products and services that we need to bill for, because those are sales that are a lot more technology driven and require more of a technology need. When we looked at our situation, we also said, besides having a platform or a solution that can solve for all these up to 100 different products and services, we also needed something that gave us the ability to include subscription-based billing, one-time billing, usage or meter-based billing, as well as annual reoccurring charges. In addition, we needed a solution that allowed our finance team to send invoices to our customers, who are our franchisees, with detail at their respective cafe level. So moving forward, there was a lot of rapid growth within our organization that has created billing challenges. To kind of speak at a high level, what that means is our billing process, say 10 years ago, was probably adequate, but with the change in the digital landscape and a lot more sales coming through digital POS and other channels outside of the traditional in-store channel, that arose for a lot more complexities, new technologies, new solutions we had to build internally, as well as other third-party vendors we had to work with that we then passed bills along. Long story short, what that means is we needed to modernize our billing. In our process at the time, it was very manual. There were a lot of spreadsheets being used, formula-driven, a lot of hands in the pot. And also, we were calculating our taxes at the same type of situation, very manually, time-consuming. There were a lot of risks that we would uncover and have to fix on the back end. And then also the acceleration of new products, services, and pricing models, which I touched upon earlier. As there's more innovation that happens in the industry, there are more products that need to be built for. And finally, we needed to maintain contracts, subscriptions, relationships with across all of those segments. So now I'm going to move forward to a new billing solution that's needed to meet those core requirements that we just spoke about. Well, the solution, we needed something that would reduce costs, find efficiencies, and generate franchisee bills faster. We also needed something that could automatically calculate our franchise services invoices and remove the manual efforts of our process. We wanted the solution to have the flexibility to allow for current, new, and future products and services. We also wanted the flexibility to have a tiered pricing, global rate adjustments, etc. Next, we needed to find a solution that would calculate our franchise invoices accurately the first time. We wanted to automate our tax calculation and find some sort of solution that allowed us to calculate our taxes at a more granular level with some of the products and services we bill for. And then finally, we switched over our general ledger to Workday in mid-2017, and we wanted to have this solution having the ability to be integrated within the Workday. So now I'm going to move forward and talk about some of the best practices that we learned from finding a solution during our implementation and why we chose BillingPlatform to be that solution. So one of the first things I'm going to touch upon is focus on configuration and not custom code. When we started our process, we made sure when we were looking at what vendors or what cloud-based solution we wanted to go with, we wanted to make sure that there was the ability to configure it on your own, not have to rely on developers. While you want to rely on them, you want to be able to make changes where it's not a long, drawn-out project, something that's very configurable from an administrative perspective by the finance end user. Also, we didn't want to focus on just the short term. We knew it was a marathon and not a sprint. We didn't want obstacles to get in the way or sacrifice certain areas which would not allow certain efficiencies to come to fruition. An example of that would be there was an extensive tiered pricing module that we had struggled with deciding how to implement. However, we did not want to let that be a hindrance. We wanted to still implement that, even though it wasn't going to be 100% implemented by the time we went live. But we wanted that ability and we wanted that structure in place so 6 months down the road or a year down the road, we would be able to implement that and whatnot. So next, we're going to talk about another best practice, which is understanding the customer hierarchy and its implications to billing, rating, and invoicing. This is really important from a project manager perspective because you need to understand, as I think a lot of people will know on this call, depending on the environment you can work on, there can be a lot of alternate hierarchies. And when you're working with a manual process, there can be even more alternate hierarchies. And a certain customer name or dimension may need to tie in with a certain name in a billing file, but it might be different in an accounting file or an IT file. But really just being that subject matter expert and understanding all the intricacies and which ones trigger billing, which ones you can ignore, which ones you need to maybe do a hierarchy cleanup on, etc. The next best practice I'm going to speak on is being strategic in how you define your products to avoid SKU proliferation. So you really just want to have the ability to look at your products, find redundancies, use the implementation, use your chance of going through and finding a new solution as you're looking through your product portfolio, and use it as an opportunity to potentially reduce your SKUs or your products and services, or is there a way to combine them into certain groups, which we did. And then finally, your billing solution really needs to reflect your business process. So now to kind of put a bow on all this, as we went through, we as a company felt that BillingPlatform was our best option, as everything I just covered on these best practices, BillingPlatform's cloud-based solution allowed for the opportunity to accomplish everything that we expected out to do. And what BillingPlatform offers, which I'll just kind of give a few of, not limited to this list, but a lot of the things that their solution allowed for, which we were able to leverage in our integration, were the subscription and recurring charges, the ability to implement tiered pricing and configure as needed, the ability to have billing triggered on events, the ability of having one-time charges, as well as the ability to easily configure metered and usage-based rating charges, and last but not least, the ability to create product bundles, which kind of ties into the SKU proliferation we were speaking about earlier. As you go through your bundles, you find areas where there's potential triggers or ways to bundle an event or a product that then provisions new products. So long story short, BillingPlatform was an excellent choice for us and really provided a lot of benefits. So now I'm going to move forward to the next slide, which is the do's when implementing a billing solution. So the first item I'll speak to is starting from ground zero. It's really important to start with a clean slate. Don't let prior processes, legacy processes, or other issues come into play. Start from ground zero. You want to start with change in mind. Secondly, you want to proactively look for billing efficiencies. It's really important in my experience, to map out the current processes, understand all the inputs and outputs, and the reasons for those. When you do that, you can usually surface a lot of the efficiencies just from that exercise alone. Next, reach out to industry analysts as well as find out what industry best practices are. However, do your own research. There is a lot of things that you may lose sight of if you don't dig in and do the research on your own and only rely on opinions from others. So you need to understand it. Involve key stakeholders early. That is the next point. Whether your organization requires an RFP or not, you still need to create a steering committee or a stakeholder type group where you're going to want to identify partners within functional areas that suit your business needs. So for example, with Panera, we had a working group with a lead from accounting, IT, operations, franchise operations, and some other functional areas here. But again, you want to have a committee that has a different perspective from a 360-degree view, so you can get everybody's feedback and suggestions as you're going through earlier and not later. You want to be able to measure twice and cut once. The next do is let your current process run parallel. So once you implement, you don't want to just go live from day one. You want to make sure you do. You may determine you need 3 parallel runs. You may determine 1, but you want to make sure everything is in sync and it's working correctly. And finally, you want to consider integrations with other systems. So I spoke earlier about finding a solution that integrated into Workday, but there's all other systems you want to make sure that there's integrations as well. For example, if you have a internal data warehouse that you leverage, you want to be able to make sure there's a functionality to have an integration there. There may be a tax software you want to integrate with. There may be other billing systems outside of your GL that you want to work with. There could be a planning cube. Regardless, you want to kind of go through and determine for your situation what systems you want integrations to be built in, as that really helps with your project scope. So now I'm going to move forward to some of the don'ts when implementing a billing solution. So the first don't is do not focus on current limitations, because you want to go run side by side with the prior do, which I had spoke of on starting from ground zero. This is your opportunity to kind of eliminate start from ground zero, so the limitations should not be limitations. Instead, when they come up, deal with them as need be, and don't let yourself be handcuffed by limitations in a legacy type environment relating to a certain process if you do not need to do that. Secondly, never forget to give yourself time for the unknown. As much as you want to hit a certain target date, or you believe something should only take X amount of weeks based on guidance you received, always add time for miscues. Always add just the typical remodeling a kitchen. Add 30% for the unknown. Same thing. Always know there's going to be things that come up, whether it's internal, external. Could be an outage. It could be, for example, here at Panera, to give you a real life example, we had a system outage where we had to freeze some of our development, and relating to this product, that was something that was not known for. But we had to kind of go on hold while we were waiting for that to get cleared up, and that pushed our project back. So there's always external circumstances that you really can't prevent that you need to bake into your estimate. Also, don't assume that you know everything. Whether it's a legacy process, whether it's a newer process, you need to know the material. You need to understand how it ticks and ties if you're the project manager or you're the owner of driving an implementation. Don't ignore future benefits. There could be other areas where you may say, hey, in the current state, I don't need to implement this. I don't need this feature of this solution. However, it may be a feature where you could say 2 years from now, we may be going to X, or we may be exploring Y. In those areas, you want to make sure that there's a structure or a foundation in place, and that the cloud-based solution you're working with has the ability to easily configure for those types of instances. And also, don't underestimate the impact of future volumes. This can be taking an approach where you're looking forward. Today we have 100 products and services. However, what if we have 200 products and services next year? Or what if we have way more metered type charges, or we need to have many more global price adjustments than we had in the past? Taking into account and making sure that your solution that you're looking for and implementing can handle future type volumes and instances, as I just spoke on. So next I'm going to move forward to the outcomes. And what were the outcomes of partnering with BillingPlatform? So the first one really is we hope franchisees will get their invoices faster. The reason for this is we took a lot of manual processes and steps and automated them, and allowed us to spend more time analyzing as opposed to manually cobbling together. This should result in franchisees getting their invoice faster. Secondly, our franchisees should get better visibility of charges and taxes at the cafe level. Third, which kind of goes hand in hand with Panera franchisees getting invoices faster, we save time by eliminating manual processes and spreadsheets that was part of our prior process. This is by leveraging this cloud-based solution. Through this implementation, we now have a centralized billing database that we can leverage for business intelligence. Another advantage and outcome is our billing accuracy will improve tremendously because there is less room for manual error, since there is about 80% of our products and services are now automated based on billing triggers defined by system rules. Finally, there's lower costs and quick onboarding. That kind of wraps up my presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Joe, and he'll walk you through this poll. And thank you all very much.
Well, thank you so much, John. And indeed, this is the second of our 3 polling questions. After we cover this polling question, we will have a discussion with John. We'll elaborate further on John's experience. So our second of 3 polling question asks the following. What we want to find out from attendees is the extent to which you agree with the following statement. My company has the flexibility to support any type of pricing or monetization model. From top to bottom, the choices are strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or I don't know. We'll give you just 1 or 2 more seconds to respond. We'll then summarize how you have responded, and then we will launch into our discussion with John, following up on the story, the case study that he shared. So what we can see thus far is that among respondents, a minority agree. So this is quite interesting. It's not a majority, a minority agree. So in other words, a plurality indicates that of respondents indicates that they agree. There's not necessarily a strong agreement. So overall, if we combine those who agree or strongly agree, it's a plurality, not a majority. I would also acknowledge that fewer than a third explicitly disagree. So what's significant here is that more than a fifth of respondents don't even know. I think a lot of attendees are starting from this point. They don't necessarily know if their company has the flexibility to support any type of pricing or monetization model. With that in mind, I'd like to elaborate, John, on your the case study that you shared. So now we're going to have a discussion with John. And the first question that I'd like to pose to you, John, has to do with the beginning, the very beginning. In other words, what were the primary reasons, John, that led Panera Bread to automate its billing processes to begin with?
Absolutely. So some of the primary reasonings were we wanted to find a solution that eliminated some of that manual risk that we had from our prior process. Like I had mentioned before, there was a lot of spreadsheets saved in multiple places, multiple cooks in the kitchen, and it was just a byproduct of us never going through an automated solution because we never needed that. But as our billing continued to become more and more complex, we really needed to find something that was automated, that we could have a system drive, and that allowed us to maintain these ever-growing products and services that kept exponentially coming through as we increased our digital footprint.
Absolutely. And the key point here is that when one does rely on multiple sources of the truth, it's difficult to maintain consistency and efficiency with regard to billing processes. Now, related to that, and then not necessarily so much on a technical level, but even on an organizational level, I'd like to give you the opportunity, John, to elaborate on challenges that your company and, in fact, many companies are likely to encounter when they set out to automate manual billing processes.
Yeah. So I think there's a multitude of challenges you're going to face. Some that come top of mind are really being able to bridge the gap from prior state with all of the, I don't want to call them hindrances, but all of the conditioning, all of the rules that are currently built on a prior process, and making the leap to essentially starting from scratch and being able to wipe your hands clean and go, hey, I need a clear canvas. I need to look at this with a fresh set of eyes, and not let the prior process continue, but don't let that drive your new process. I think there's a lot of, regardless of what industry you're in, we feel like we do it this way because somebody demanded it happen this way, or this system we used to use made us do it this way, so we do it this way, as opposed to a lot of those scope creep. And really what I'm trying to get to is scope creep can really happen if you don't take all the data, understand all the pros and cons, do a SWOT analysis on your implementation and what you're trying to achieve, but don't let scope creep happen. Make sure you understand what you're trying to set out to do. There's nothing wrong with taking time to become an expert and understanding your process from front to end. And when you have a steering committee, making sure to take everybody's feedback, but know there's kind of a hard stop where it's a great idea, and I think that's a great consideration. We need to move forward, and we can't get strapped down in every little nuance. So it's really, that would kind of be my response to that.
And just to follow up, John, before I get to our next question, what it sounds like is the matter of determining priorities, but it's an informed decision about what to prioritize. So in addition to figuring out what to automate, it's also what's the most important aspects of the billing processes to automate. And of course, related to that is determining what billing processes may need to change as a result of automation, and to what extent can one improve billing processes with automation. But I wanted to ask you, John, did you find that prioritization, just based on what you've shared, was something that was important, that became key in determining what aspects of your billing processes lent themselves best to automation?
Yes. As we went through and decided what are the key items that we would like a new system to do, we went through and prioritized our desired outcomes from highest priority to this would be a nice to have, but it's really not a need to have. And we went through, and as we went through, we would align any of the suggestions or we should look at doing this, or why don't we continue doing it this way, with how does that stack up with our prioritization. And yes, so having a roadmap with your outcomes as well as your priorities is highly important.
Absolutely. And the impact of deciding what the priorities are affects, the impact is not only on the finance team, of course, on the overall organization. So in determining the impact of automation, automating manual billing processes, I want to pose our next question to you, John, which is what has been the impact of automating manual billing processes, not only on mechanics of billing within your finance team, but throughout your company?
Yeah, I mean, we have already seen certain products and services where we've identified potential errors that didn't happen, that in the parallel run would have happened, but the system caught. So I guess what I'm getting at is finding improved accuracy to your other than finance. There's other groups, whether it be our tax team, our data management team. We've identified other metrics and other, I guess you would call them, not KPIs, but other attributes to begin housing and tracking within our data warehouse that we needed in order to drive a recommended billing. And that was all uncovered through going through the implementation process. We really need to know X number of kiosks or certain conditions that we hadn't tracked before, and that allowed us to trigger a follow-up to create a workflow to track those types of indicators. So we've seen it broad-based, and then also as our next phase in this process, as we've newly implemented it, is getting more detailed invoices to our franchisees and giving them an updated view that will provide them with more detail at the tax level, which we look forward to doing here in the short-term future.
Absolutely. And that's something that's key, is there are so many nuances with regard to billing. And also you've made reference, John, to subscription billing. Before we move on to our next question, just wanted to ask, has subscription billing or that type of model emerged as something that affects the overall company in terms of, it's not just billing, but it's the business model, the impact of the business model? To what extent has that driven the impact of automating billing processes throughout your company?
No, you hit the nail right on the head. So having subscription and event type based billing that is, triggered based on events or subscription dates that this platform allows you to set up seamlessly. It has allowed for a lot of issues in the past, or in a prior process, I guess I would say, where you had to go through, hey, we have these 500 subscriptions that reoccur annually. I got to go hunt down this spreadsheet. I got to hope that an error doesn't happen when I'm manually opening it and working magic to it. And then I send it off to this party, and then I have to make sure that they don't make any changes to this manual spreadsheet. Having a subscription that is automatically generated within the solution has just allowed for a more fluid process, and I'd say minimal, if no, not being prone to error, as it's all just simply based on here's the date, here's when the subscription reoccurs, and you set it and you're done.
Exactly, and that's really key because with subscriptions, you want to make sure that you're aware of when the start is at the very least, and also there's a lot of potential complexity in the absence of automation with subscription and event-based billing. So with that in mind, John, I wanted to ask, and this is, you talk about preparing for the unknown. There is a lot of learning that goes on when implementing automation, and what are some lessons learned? We can either talk about them as mistakes, or we can talk about them as lessons learned, but in posing our next question, I want to ask what lessons learned or mistakes should finance leaders keep in mind, and should finance teams strive to avoid? So, in other words, there are mistakes finance teams can make, but also lessons learned that finance team leaders should keep in mind when determining how to go about automating manual billing processes. What would you recommend?
You do not want to. I think that you could take this in so many ways. However, there is never going to be it kind of ties back to the first question you had asked me, and when we talk about prioritization. Don't lose sight of your prioritizations when you're going through and deciding how you want to automate your processes. There's so many different tools out there and or methods or subscriptions or cloud-based models that you can use. However, align that with what your desired outcomes are. Align that with what you're trying to achieve, and don't lose sight of that. So avoid going down rat holes or making sure everybody is aligned with what we want to achieve. And as we are scrubbing through different potential solutions during whether it's an RFP process or not, don't lose sight of those prioritized objectives. Also, as you're going through, you want to not get established, which I had talked about earlier, establish a working group. Find leaders from different parts of the organizations that can help be your guardrails and give you feedback as you're moving forward. So when you have an outcome that you weren't expecting happen, it's a much easier conversation. And really the bigger benefit that is usually that will eliminate some future potential outcomes, because if you have the right people in the room to give you feedback as you're ongoing.
I think you made a really great point earlier in your presentation, John, that you always have to plan for the unknown, even if you don't know what the unknown is, whether it's an outage, to use the example you cited earlier. To what extent would you advise that finance leaders, those who are involved, have a stake in automating manual billing processes, create or establish scenarios or do some type of scenario planning? You can't plan for every scenario, of course, but given the centrality of billing, what would you recommend just in terms of some basic scenario planning, especially to anticipate the black swan type events that may become more common over time, for example?
Joe, that makes sense. I think contingency planning is really important, regardless if it's in a budgeting process, forecasting process, or simply in a implementation of a product or service, as in this example. So not losing sight of this type of scenario or this type of contingency scenario. You want when you're going through with your working group, and you want to throw everything to the wall and every potential option, even if it's that'll never happen again. This could happen, but it'll never happen. Assume it could happen, and at least have a thought process in place of what do we do if this happens? How do we pivot or audible if this happens? Don't take no for an answer or something will never happen, because anything can happen when you're dealing with technology and customers and different events. So you really need to put a bow on it, plan for the unknown.
Absolutely, absolutely. And with that in mind, speaking of priorities, wanted to hear your thoughts, John, priorities that finance leaders ought to keep in mind, what they ought to take away, key takeaways, when considering not only whether to automate manual billing processes, but how best to do so.
I think one of the most important pieces of it is finding the right mix of individuals that are going to go and lead that project, because whenever you're going to implement any type of project, there's always going to be resistance, and a lot of it's usually, it makes sense. The resistance is because, well, no, that's the way this process works. We can't change it, or whatnot, or resistance from another perspective. But what I would say is finding somebody who's willing to, whether it's in your working group, that can be your subject matter expert, that understands everything from front to end. So they kind of are the expert in every potential thing. And when issues arise, when we go back to your prior question, when the unknown happens, when there's some sort of contingency area that pops up that you planned for, or you had no idea that was even possible, the more you understand the legacy process, and the more you understand the nuts and bolts of the new implementation you're putting in, that right there is the recipe for, one, a successful implementation, as well as advantages that you are going to reap from doing an implementation.
Exactly. And before we move on to our third polling question, just wanted to follow up on something that you said, John. The focus on this discussion has been franchisees. Is there any feedback, or if not feedback, any observations regarding how franchisees have adapted in light of automation of manual billing processes?
That's kind of our final phase that we're working through now, is getting some updates. So that's still a work in progress. Most of our efficiencies that we have identified so far have been internal. However, what I will say is we feel improved our accuracy, which downstream has allowed us to eliminate potential errors that we would have seen in a prior state. So therefore, they are feeling the effects indirectly. But the great thing about this billing platform tool, as well as the way we integrated it, is it's very customizable. And what I had mentioned earlier in the presentation, we picked billing platform and we implemented it in mind with, you don't need to have custom code for every change. You don't need to have somebody go in and be an expert in SQL or an expert in this. It's very user friendly. The GUI is great. You can train an end user to understand it, and that's the approach we took.
Sure. The easier it is to make changes, especially when they have an effect on a lot of people, such as in a subscription-based or event-based scenario. You don't want to have to hard code everything every time you need to make a change. Well, John, I really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion. Before we address some great questions we've received from attendees, I do want to pose our third 3 polling questions for attendees. And so what I will now do is pose that question right now before we address some great questions from attendees. Our third polling question asks attendees to indicate within what time frame, if any, your organization intends to begin looking at a new billing solution. From top to bottom, the choices are: we recently implemented one, this year, next year, we have no plans, or I don't know. And what we can see is that among respondents, I think what's interesting is that a significant percentage are still in the process of making a decision, but I would acknowledge that what is certainly encouraging is that if not a majority, close to a majority, fairly close to a majority, but not yet a majority, have either implemented one or planning to do so this year or next year. I would acknowledge, though, and this is why many attendees are joining us, is a lot need to make a decision. So about 20% of respondents have indicated you don't know. That's fine. That's why you're here. And with that in mind, we do want to answer your questions. So what we'll do now is address some great questions that we have received from attendees. And this is a question from an attendee that I think we can pose a little more broadly. And that has to do with, we've talked about areas other than finance. And John, what areas other than finance would you recommend, would you advise that finance leaders include in not only the decision to implement automation or the automation of manual billing processes, but going about that effort? In other words, in addition to finance, what other areas of the company should be involved?
Yeah, and it depends on the organization and what this roles would be, functional roles would be called, but essentially the relationship managers, or whether it's a sales manager or a advocate, or if it's housed in an operations team, but ultimately the users that manage the relationships with the customer that receives ultimately the end bill and invoice that the system you have upstream is delivering. So that's somebody that you never want to lose sight of and get their input, thinking I want to display this, hey, this will be a big win, but it's not even going to be caught if we don't hype it up for you or sell it. Or you need to consider when you're billing this, it's not going to work because of A, B, and C. But ultimately, the relationship manager, whether it's sales or operations, you need to incorporate them.
Absolutely. And when you talk about sales and operations, so for example, a scenario where there might be some type of promotion, I'm just going to make one up for argument's sake. There's a promotion that, some franchisees are involved with and some aren't, for example. So I would imagine that if there is a decision that has to do with whether it's promotional efforts or other efforts that have some impact on billing in some way, that decisions that an organization makes would involve a lot of different parties. I guess my question then related to that, before we get to additional questions from attendees, is to what extent do you have to make the decision about who can participate in the decision? In other words, to what extent is it appropriate to involve other areas of the company other than finance? To what extent is it not appropriate? In other words, how do you decide, speaking of prioritization, how do you decide who's involved in a decision that has an impact on billing, for example?
Yeah. So everything you said made sense. I guess what I would kind of, to your question and to chime in, would be related to the sales piece. So when I was speaking of sales originally, in our world, this set of services, our customer is the franchise. But we have integral roles that manage those relationships. They're not really salespeople, but they're kind of they're franchise support. So if our customer has an issue, which is our franchisee, they're going to want to understand, hey, why did this happen? Or why do I need this? Or why are you asking me to invest in this, et cetera. So I was just trying to align it with other industries out there that might not have that same type of business model, but something similar where they manufacture a product and there's salespeople in the field that work with the end customer to write their POs or to sell their goods. And those individuals are, having those feet on the ground that can give you the info, since they're likely the ones who are going to hear about any changes, whether it's good or bad, if something changes on the front end in terms of billing.
Absolutely. And it having the people on the ground who know what's going on is vital, and also, helps to inform decisions. Now, speaking of decisions, an attendee asks, did you look at options or, what options did you consider? I'm not going to refer to specific vendors or specific companies that makes billing software, but did you look at options for off-the-shelf systems before deciding to build one? Now, an attendee is asking this question. I think, obviously you did. So I guess my question is, to what extent is it accurate to look at it to what extent is that question accurate, looking at off-the-shelf systems before deciding to build one? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so just to clear up, to make sure we're all on the same page, I would say the billing platform is an off-the-shelf system, and that we didn't really decide to build one. I mean, with any off-the-shelf platform any cloud-based solution you go to, there's still always going to be some development work on your end. It's just the extent of how much you need to put into it in terms of the upfront implementation. But we went with an off-the-shelf system and found appropriate integrations as needed with our GL and our data warehouse. And yes, we did look at other options. We actually started with 10 options. We used the help of Gartner Research, who gave us, we explained to them our case study, what we were trying to accomplish. They gave us a preliminary list. We did our own research. We didn't want it to be, we took enough due diligence to go through, and we eliminated to 3 candidates, with BillingPlatform being one of them. And ultimately, after weighing the pros and the cons, we thought the solution was the best fit for us and our needs.
Absolutely. I appreciate your clearing that up, by the way. I think that's really helpful for attendees. And I want to acknowledge we've received great questions from attendees. We may not have the opportunity to get to all of them. We will plan to follow up on any remaining questions after our webcast. And I would point out that when this webcast is available on demand later this week within the webcast section of CFO.com, you will be able to view and listen to a streaming archive of our webcast, download a PDF document that comprises slides from our webcast, click on a link to view information about upcoming events that offer the opportunity to hear from and meet finance leaders in person, and, if you are eligible, retrieve your CPE certificate. I'd also note that at the very end of our webcast, we will invite attendees to complete an online feedback survey. The feedback survey will appear in a separate browser window that you will be able to view if you have turned off your pop-up blocker within your web browser. And as always, we appreciate your feedback. Once again, I'm Joe Fleischer, moderator of our webcast, and on behalf of our guest, and John, I would really like to thank you very much for joining us for our webcast, for sharing your case study, for sharing your insights during our discussion, and for answering some questions from attendees.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure, and we really appreciate such an engaging and informative presentation and discussion. And so on behalf of John of Panera Bread and our sponsor, we very much appreciate your joining us for our webcast, How Panera Bread Automated Manual Billing Processes, brought to you by Argyle, the publisher of CFO Magazine and CFO.com, and sponsored by BillingPlatform. We thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.